So this has been a summary of Freud's theory, focusing on the major aspects. But as I said earlier, the scope of his theory is considerable. He had a lot to say about dreams, for instance, arguing that they were a form of wish fulfillment. And he distinguished what he called the latent dream from the manifest dream, the dream as it really is from the dream that's experienced and remembered, and talked a lot about the symbolism of dreams. So dream interpretation is something which has had a very, very long tradition. But Freud systematized it and to some extent adopted more of a scientific perspective on it. Freud talked about myth in literature, where he argued that often things like fairy tales expressed aspects of the unconscious and capture certain universal themes. And he developed a theory of the origin of religion, linking it to things like a desire for a father figure and broader aspects of humanity, connecting it to his general theory of where civilization comes from. If you're interested in this work, there's a really rich body of ideas to explore. So far we've talked about what Freud said, but now let's address the question, how much of it's true and how much of it's good science? Because there's two ways to reject a theory. A theory could be wrong, or it could contain a lot of mistaken claims. So for instance, if you thought that the disorders of schizophrenia or autism were caused by bad parenting, well, that's a theory. It's certainly mistaken. There's too much evidence against it. But another problem with a theory is that it could be too vague to test. It could just be storytelling. One physicist famously derided the work of a colleague by saying, "He's not right. He's not even wrong." And what scientists aspire to do is to at least be wrong, to have theories that are of such specificity and testability that they could be proven mistaken. And the philosopher Karl Popper talked about this idea with the notion of falsifiability. So he pointed out that what distinguishes science from non-science is that scientific predictions make strong claims about the world and run the risk of being proven false. That is, he argued, you know you're dealing with a science when there are ways to prove its claims wrong. So, for instance, suppose we were to make claims like this. Damage to the part of the brain known as the hippocampus causes failures of implicit memory but not explicit memory. Or, everywhere in the world, men should prefer, on average, to have more sexual partners than women prefer. Or, exposure to violent television makes children more violent. Or, ingestion of certain drugs makes the symptoms of schizophrenia go away. Are these true or false? Well, each and every one of these claims we'll discuss later on in the course, and I'll also explain to you what implicit memory and explicit memory are. But the point here is these are the sorts of things that could be proven false. This is the stuff of science. These are interesting and substantive claims. I think very few philosophers today would agree with Popper's claim that falsifiability is the absolute criteria through which you could distinguish science from non-science. But what they would agree with is that if the claim is too vague to be proven false or too slippery to be proven false, then you may not be dealing with a scientific theory in the first place. So I'm a Capricorn, and here's a horoscope for my day. Your energy is focused on work today, maybe a bit too much so. It's a good time to get a lot done for sure, but try to make sure that your relationships don't suffer as a result. The problem with this horoscope isn't that it's wrong. It's that it's so vague it can't be wrong, depending on what you mean by work. There's always going to be something to be said for your energies focused too much on work. And advice is so banal and empty that there's nothing that can happen where you could say, oh, that was bad advice, I shouldn't have done that. I kind of prefer the horoscope I got from the satirical magazine The Onion. There's no worse fate than dying alone. Thankfully, you'll be surrounded by hundreds of airline passengers when it happens. And part of the humor of this, besides its unremitting grimness and honesty, is that it's specific. It's a specific horoscope, and you never see that. And this is, of course, the sort of thing which could be wrong. If a scientist told me they had a theory of future behavior and they predicted how people were going to die, and they were right, I'd say that's incredible science. So take this back to Freud. One of the main accusations of Freudian theory is that it's unfalsifiable. It's based a lot on anecdotes, on descriptions of clinical events, and in fact, the therapeutic environment itself has a sort of unfalsifiability to it. So imagine you're dealing with a therapist, and your therapist, suppose you're lucky enough to be treated by Freud himself, says you hate your mother. And then if the patient says, oh, wow, what an insight, that's true, the therapist would say, well, I'm right, this supports me. But suppose Freud said you hate your mother, and the patient is outraged. No, I don't. That's horrible. Well, Freud could say, well, your anger shows this idea is painful for you. You have repressed it from consciousness. I am right. And when dealing with somebody who has a Freudian explanation, here's the ultimate cause of your problems, of your anxiety. Part of the problem is it's not clear what could ever prove that explanation wrong. And if you can't prove it wrong, it's not science. And more to the point, it's not very interesting. Now, to be fair, a lot of Freudians and a lot of the scholars who have followed and been influenced by Freud's ideas have tried to take his ideas and turn them into empirical, falsifiable claims. And if you think about it, a lot of what we talked about in this lecture, it does admit of testing. So, for instance, if Freud's right, your experience of breastfeeding should be a reliable predictor of your personality later on in life. If Freud is right, your experience of toilet training should be a reliable predictor of your experience later in life. If Freud is right, whether or not you're raised by one parent or two, whether or not you're raised by a man and woman or two men, two women, should have a profound effect on the Electra complex, the Oedipus complex, and so on. Freud made specific claims about the origin of sexual preference, and he certainly made a lot of claims about the success of psychoanalysis. So to some extent, a lot of Freudians would say the proof is in the pudding. Psychoanalysis rests on a Freudian analysis of what's going on. And so if the Freudian analysis is correct, you would expect this method of treatment to be uniquely powerful in curing people's problems. Unfortunately, most people believe that it isn't.